Note: throughout this lecture I'll be referring to transition metals or minerals. I'm not a chemist, and as such I'm not using the term to refer to an element whose atom has a partially filled d subshell, or which can give rise to cations with an incomplete d subshell, whatever the hell that means. Though, as it turns out, lots of transition metals like cobalt, titanium, molybdenum, and cadmium are also transition metals in the chemical sense. By transition metals, I mean those metals that will be key to fueling the global transition to renewable, sustainable energy systems. These metals really run the gamut in terms of technologies of production, barriers to entry, and value to weight. Some, like bauxite, are point-source resources with low value to weight and relatively high capital intensity. Others, like platinum, can be mined from alluvial deposits, have minimal barriers to entry, and extremely high value to weight. What they all have in common is that they are A, incredibly important to the energy transition, and B, demand for all of them is forecast to skyrocket in the coming years. These metals are critical to the energy transition, both on the power generation side and on the consumption side. Starting with the power generation side, this handy figure from the International Energy Agency shows the amount of several key transition metals necessary to generate a given amount of energy. It's not close. Offshore wind installations like this one require over 15,000 kilograms of these different minerals. Natural gas and coal require a fraction of that. The same is true on the consumption side. An internal combustion powered car contains about 35 kilograms of these minerals. An electric car requires over 200 of them. Because of this, the energy transition will cause demand for these materials to really skyrocket. To get to a net zero future by 2050, the world will have to produce 6 times the volume of these metals by 2040. Demand for some of these minerals is forecast to increase even more than that. The energy transition will certainly be more sustainable from a climate change perspective, but it will require a vast increase in mining exploration and effort that will likely have complex dynamics in the locations where it is conducted. The broad question is whether this transition is going to lead to a new resource curse, with political effects similar to those of oil and gas wealth in the 20th and early 21st centuries. There are reasonable arguments on both sides. Let's start with the transition metal resource curse argument. First, these are clearly strategic resources. Recall that strategic resources are the raw materials, usually metals but also forms of fuel, that are necessary for building, supplying, and deploying modern militaries and securing the viability of the economies that sustain them. This is the USS Zumwalt, a 610-foot, $4.3 billion investment in the U.S. Navy's dominance of the maritime space. The shells designed to be fired by its main gun cost roughly $1 million per. To say that it's high-tech is an understatement. What goes into crafting something like this? A lot of engineering, obviously, but also steel, aluminum, which is made from bauxite, and a bunch of copper, titanium, and other rare earth metals. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union jockeyed for influence and control over countries with large exportable supplies of these strategic resources. This meddling in resource-rich countries was overwhelmingly anti-democratic in nature, from Allende and copper-exporting Chile, to Lumumba and copper and uranium-rich Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mossadegh and oil-rich Iran. The historical record is littered with U.S. and Western involvement in, or support of coups against elected leaders whose political platforms and policies threatened Western, primarily US and UK, economic interests in strategic natural resources. And that meddling actually continued into the post-Cold War era.
It's been interesting to see that China has been more vocal about what the events that are going on in Myanmar in the past few weeks than in other cases. With Wang Yi, China's foreign affairs minister, in a phone call with regional counterparts, expressing a hope to see the situation resolve itself peacefully and for stability to return to Myanmar, and also explaining that he wishes to see an advance in the domestic process for democratic transformation. Now, why are Myanmar's protesters still very suspicious of China? There's many reasons for this. Mostly, first of all, that Wang Yi, China's foreign affairs minister, held a meeting with the leader of Myanmar's military a few weeks before the coup, but also because there has been a close relationship between China and Myanmar's military military in the past, especially when Myanmar was a target of international sanctions, and that China was the only country that it could turn to for support. Also, it doesn't help that there's been a lot of mixed messaging on the Chinese side, especially when the coup occurred. Chinese state media described it as a major cabinet reshuffle. So officially, China's position on what's been happening in Myanmar it's simple. It's easy to say, actually.
Concerns about competition over strategic resources are really resurfacing, fueled by the economic and military rise of China. To the extent that U.S.-China competition begins to resemble a new Cold War, this may lead to more of this anti-democratic meddling in resource-rich states. Second, the point source and capital-intensive nature of many of these resources is ripe for the resource curse. Point source resources are very, very amenable to government capture, either directly, in the form of nationalization, or indirectly, in the form of taxation and licensing fees. It bears mentioning, however, that the economic paradigms that were dominant in the 1950s through the 1970s, the paradigms of state-led development, have fallen mostly out of favor. But the point stands. The technology of production for most transition metals is amenable to the kind of convenient tax handles and weak fiscal contracts that facilitate the emergence of the resource curse. Third, many large deposits of these minerals are in countries with weak political and economic institutions. Half of the world's cobalt reserves are in DRC. The world's largest bauxite reserves are in Guinea, a West African country with a limited history of conflict but nevertheless relatively weak governance mechanisms and institutions. This is not universally the case, but it's logical to expect that, just like the last 2 decades of commodity exploration, the future search for these minerals will push mining companies further and further into weak governance environments. And since the quality of pre-existing institutions before resource wealth is discovered matters a lot, this does not augur particularly well for avoiding resource curse dynamics. Now, all that notwithstanding, there are several reasons to be skeptical that transition metals will produce similar curse dynamics. For one, they tend not to generate the sheer volume of rents that oil and natural gas do. The marginal cost of production of a metric ton of oil in Saudi Arabia is approximately $40. That oil is worth, on today's market, about $600. That's 1,400% profit. The margins on most transition metals are nowhere near that. Nickel currently sells for about 50% more than its extraction and refinement costs. The margins for copper are closer to 100%, but the price has been quite volatile. As late as 2015, copper was selling for less than its actual extraction costs. Cobalt has some larger margins, but those are still currently only about 150%. What all of this means is that, at least under current market conditions, transition metals are not going to generate the kind of truly massive rents, remember rents are profits in excess of cost of production, that oil and natural gas do. The second reason is the total size of the market. Let's do some crude calculations. In 2020, total global cobalt production was estimated at 140,000 metric tons. At a market price of $53,500 per ton, that puts the total value of production at $7.5 billion. Now, even 100 years from now, $7.5 billion will still be a lot of money. But it's nothing like the size of the market for oil. Total global production was nearly 33 billion barrels last year. At an average price of $60 a barrel, the total value of global oil production was nearly $3 trillion. Mining can generate vast profits, but oil and gas have historically been in a league of their own. And if we think that abundant resource rents are the crux of the resource curse, this augurs well. A second reason we may be less concerned about curse dynamics with transition metals is that all of the future exploration will be occurring in a world where corporate social responsibility and attaining a social license to operate are norms. During the scramble to secure oil resources in the 20th century, the voices decrying US and UK meddling in the affairs of places like Iran and Zaire were few and far between. Owing to the success of the good governance initiatives we discussed last week, those considerations will be part of the discussion moving forward. A third reason we may be less concerned is that some of the structural need for energy infrastructure will likely taper off as the transition occurs. Fossil fuel energy sources require constant consumption. The fossil fuels themselves are the consumable. With sustainable energy sources, the largest sources of demand for minerals are in creating infrastructure and storage. Once those are up and running, we get the wind and sun and water essentially for free. So the long-term structure of demand will likely look very different from these resources than it has for coal, oil, and natural gas. A final reason is related to the intellectual environment in which this exploration effort will occur. As I mentioned earlier, in contrast to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the search for these resources of the future will take place during a period where state monopolies are not the norm, and private sector investment, or public-private partnerships, are. Under private ownership, resource rents are captured by the government through licensing fees or taxation of corporate income. Private ownership of these resources creates the necessary preconditions for a fiscal contract, the asymmetry of resources and capabilities between society, which has a comparative advantage in the generation of an economic surplus, and the state, which has a comparative advantage in the provision of market-sustaining goods. In order for society to generate that surplus, some public goods must be provided. This situation gives the state an incentive to develop a capable bureaucracy for extracting revenue from society, and society an incentive to demand responsible behavior on the part of the government. From this exchange, strong legal and representative institutions are more likely to emerge. Thus, one of the prescriptions for avoiding the resource curse may be for states to get out of the mineral industry entirely, focusing instead on taxing the industry and providing it with the public goods necessary to facilitate production and export. Now, before delving into the public versus private ownership in detail, it's important to note that just placing mineral resources in private hands may not ensure that stronger political and revenue-generating institutions actually develop. The incentives to develop capable bureaucracies to extract revenue are roughly proportional to the degree of difficulty in levying taxes. Point source resources are easy to tax because of two factors relating to their geographic concentration. First, producers can be identified, monitored, and coerced relatively easily. And second, the territorial concentration of production and labor constitutes a natural tax handle, or bottleneck in the production of a good, which makes evasion inherently more difficult. Convenient tax handles do not promote the development of highly capable bureaucracies. Now, for countries considering the structure of resource ownership moving forward, scholars like Erica Weinthal and Pauline Jones-Luong have advocated for private domestic ownership. Such ownership may be feasible for countries with adequate expertise in mineral exploration and accumulated stock of physical capital. But what about countries with little or no indigenous expertise and investment capital? We'll come back to that question in just a second. One reason why Weinthal and Luong's proposal has not received more attention has to do with the performance of the central case around which it was originally based, that of the post-Soviet experience in Russia. Their work charts the privatization of the oil sector in Russia in the 1990s, noting that privatization had the effect of both making the Russian oil sector more competitive and establishing independent economic actors like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who could press the Russian government for continued economic reforms and greater political transparency. But it did not exactly work out the way the theoretical logic would have suggested.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky was arrested in October 2003 for tax evasion. Then, aged 40, he sat on one of Russia's biggest fortunes. He had acquired it through the privatization of massive companies in the 1990s. He was hated by many as a get-rich-easy figure. Platon Lebedev, his right-hand man, had been picked up a few months earlier. He headed the conglomerate Menatep, which included the oil group Yukos and handled vast resources of state money. Khodorkovsky, with a degree in chemical engineering, had bought Yukos in 1995. It was President Boris Yeltsin's concession to him for having financed his election campaign. It was said that a dispute between Khodorkovsky and Yeltsin's successor Vladimir Putin was behind the arrest. They were fierce rivals, one with the money, commanding the equivalent of 360 million euros to buy Yukos, the other with the political power. The oligarch worked tirelessly, applying Western management methods as the sector boomed, swelling his fortune to some $15 billion. He even saw a possible merger with the American ExxonMobil. The Kremlin glowered. Putin had vowed to cut the oligarchs down to size. Khodorkovsky, the industrialist, was bad enough, but when he encroached further into politics, he crossed a red line. He sought openly to finance Liberal Party campaigning, political opposition to Putin. His Open Russia Foundation promoted democracy, civil liberties, and judicial reform. His arrest came 2 months ahead of legislative elections. He was convicted and sentenced at first to 8 years in prison, then also for petrol theft, 250 million tons, and money laundering, and sentenced for 14 years. He steadfastly mocked the legal process as deeply tainted. He became a symbol of anti-authoritarianism. Yukos was billed for taxes so high it couldn't pay, and was broken up and auctioned into the hands of the state.
Khodorkovsky's prosecution and incarceration, the bankrupting of Yukos, and the reconsolidation of the Russian state's position in the Russian oil market show how privatization in the extractive sector can be undone, and pretty quickly. So one solution to this dilemma, both the lack of a fiscal contract and the potential that many of the countries where these resources are going to be located do not have the kind of technical expertise necessary to access their resources, would be to court greater foreign investment in the form of encouraging partnerships between Western and non-Western entities for joint exploration and development. And examples of this approach are already abundant. Uganda's Albertine Rift deposits were jointly developed by Total, Tullow, and Sinopec, which is the Chinese national oil firm. Royal Dutch Shell and Sinopec are partnering to explore 2 offshore blocks in Gabon, and Kazakhstan's Kazimuna partnered with both Western and Chinese firms to develop the Kashagan field in the Caspian Sea. Joint partnerships are attractive to host countries for 2 reasons. First, they promote greater transparency. In a single firm host government arrangement, the multinational corporation has little incentive to make private information public, and the cost of monitoring the terms of the agreement fall entirely on the host country government and civil society, which in many of these countries is pretty nascent. Multi-firm arrangements introduce additional parties with financial incentives to verify claims by both the government and other multinational corporations. These incentives are true both generally and specifically with respect to Western partners. Western civil society groups have driven good governance initiatives in the extractive sector, as I argued in last week's lecture. The involvement of Western firms in developing mineral resources, even with minority stakes, draws the attention of these watchdog groups and offloads some of the costs of monitoring compliance with both international law and the specific terms of agreements with host countries onto those interested third parties. Although some governments may not view this enhanced scrutiny as a very good thing, for governments that are actually seeking to minimize the political effects of the resource curse, it is likely to help. Moreover, this scrutiny is likely to have positive spillovers for domestic civil society in host countries, which can benefit from tapping into the broader, more financially established activist networks that often have issue-specific technical expertise, right? They know how to watch industries and businesses in particular industries. Second, and from a geopolitical perspective, joint partnerships dilute the political influence of the multinational corporation's home country government by pitting its interests against the interest of other major powers. The 1953 CIA and MI6-backed ouster of Mossadegh in Iran, which followed his decision to nationalize the Iranian oil industry at the expense of Anglo-Persian Oil, which was later BP, is but one example of the potential dangers associated with hosting major power investment in strategic resources. It's really hard to imagine a similar situation playing out in a country hosting both Western and Chinese investments, for instance. For this reason, host country governments may find that joint Western-non-Western partnerships provide them with greater insurance against multinational corporation meddling in their domestic affairs, and paradoxically, actually give them more policy autonomy. Of course, given the trajectory of things in the international arena, it's not immediately clear that there are going to be lots of Western and non-Western partnerships in the offering. This brief lecture has discussed some of the geopolitical implications of the shift to more sustainable global energy systems, with an eye particularly toward how this transition will affect prospects for the emergence of the resource curse in countries endowed with large deposits of transition minerals. We end, as is usually the case, with as many questions as we started with. Hopefully, the questions are different and more nuanced, but they remain. Of one thing, however, I'm pretty certain. Your generation of thinkers and doers will be the one that really has to grapple with these issues in real time. I hope this class has helped prepare you for that. See you soon.